Okay, this is an historic occasion, and I hope in 100 years' time somebody will note this being a historic occasion, because it really is the launch of the new museum and art gallery. And this was what was happening over 100 years ago, and I think the technology probably worked better in those days than it has done this morning. But I'll be talking a little bit just before Jill kicks in, just to set the scene about how we're referencing the history of the music hall, and indeed the history of the museum, as inspiration really for what we want to do with our future programming. What was happening 170 years ago, the music hall was built in 1839 and opened in 1840, was quite remarkable. And we have, thanks to Shropshire Archives, we have a fantastic collection of the original bill posters. And I would urge you to have a look. I've just brought up 3 samples today, but again we're going to be making them available online, and we're going to be showing some of them at Rowley's house too. They are a fantastic social history of what was happening with art, science, technology, and we have a hard act to follow when we open the new museum, because what was being achieved was quite remarkable. So, that's, I think, what I wanted to say just to start with. I would just say that you've all got a feedback form on your seat. I'm going to take it as read that the first thing that we'll have on the feedback form is start on time. So you don't really need to put it down, because we'll just take that as read. If you'd like to put any other feedback, we'd be really grateful, because it will inform how we run the programme. It will inform our future thinking. So it is an important part of your participation in the whole process. And then just before I start to talk a little bit about the history, set the scene for Jill, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our sponsors and supporters. The Arts Council England have supported what we're doing here at Shrewsbury hugely. And I'd also like to say a huge thank you to FBC Manby Bowdler, who have supported this particular part of the programme, and we're delighted and very grateful for your involvement. So thank you very much. And you have the love seats at the back. Okay. Right. I should have said start filming.
Started.
Thought you would. This is a bit of a signature image that you're looking at. You've seen it on the information, you've seen it on the flyers. It's the work of Tracey Emin, who's a very well-known, infamously known artist, part of the Young British Artists group that include Damien Hirst and others. It's used as a signature image here because we're going to be having this piece of work in the new museum when it opens, courtesy of the Frank Cohen collection, of which I'll talk more about either later or on another occasion. What it does for me is it sets up the whole sort of context for the questioning of what we know and how do we know what we know. And the whole history of the music hall and the museum was about that investigation. And in those days, they felt that the establishment of a museum could lead to a fantastic increase in our knowledge about the world. So, 177 years ago, the museum was established at a meeting. It was resolved to establish a natural history society for the county of Salop, as they referred to it, and North Wales, and to found a central museum and scientific library. And in pursuance of an object so important, I just love the language of all this stuff. You can tell I'm steeped in the sort of mid-19th century language at the moment. And in pursuance of an object so important to the promotion of science within this extensive district, it was resolved to solicit the concurrence and cooperation of the nobility, clergy, gentry, and inhabitants generally of Shropshire in North Wales. Consider yourselves part of this whole historic process. The museum is principally designed for the gradual formation of complete and systematic arrangements of the natural history of the district. They actually believed in the mid-19th century that they could make a complete collection. They were working towards some sort of completion of acquiring objects and gaining knowledge. We now know that that was, not ever going to be possible, but it was part of the thing. And a suitable repository for such remains of antiquity as are found in the district. So museums were proliferating. We're talking about 1835. In the sort of 30 or 40 years from that point, museums were being developed all over the country. And they were new institutions. We take them for granted. We really do take the fact that we have museums for granted. They were a new form, a new institution, with fantastic social, educational, and creative aspirations. So the museum forms with no premises. And then in 1840, 1839, as I said, actually, was when the musical was built. But this is an opening programme from 1840, which celebrates the opening of the new musical. At this point, I always want to say that in 1839, photography was invented. And that is an absolutely critical thing within the history of modern art. There was a very famous outburst at the time when photography suddenly appeared on the scene. And you imagine the impact of that on society. And the famous phrase was, "From now, painting is dead." Nothing could have been further from the truth. Painting was there, liberated, was changed, had to become something else. But I often use the invention of photography to explain to students or youngsters that if you think about the invention of photography as the start of that whole process of modern art coming into being, it's a very good, very simple way of thinking about what was happening visually and how artists were freed from having to be mimetic and having to be cameras. So, this is one of our earliest photographs of the interior of the musical, set up for one of its lectures, one of its talks. We don't know exactly what. You can see palm trees in the background. And then, as I say, an amazing program happening within that institution. Really spectacular visual exhibitions, dioramas, magic lantern slides, phantoscopes, spectroscopes. It was about the latest technology. And that's again where we now in the 21st century think of ourselves as opening a museum that's going to be concerned with the new and the now. It was already happening. It's a mistake to think that they were not really, really excited by the new developments of technology and knowledge. The Natural History Society did actually move into Vaughan's Mansion. It was the first time it had a premises, some years after it was formed. And it remained within that complex until 1885, when it moved to what is now the public library, the old Shrewsbury School. So the fact that we're going back into the musical and back into Vaughan's Mansion in 2013 is a fantastic closing of a long circle of relationships between the museum and the musical. Right, let's speed up. In 1864, Shrewsbury Institution, in union with the Society of Arts, very importantly, moved into the musical to create a very, very vigorous program of activity on top of what was already happening. And remember, the museum was in there at this point. The Society of Natural History was in there too. They were creating a newsroom, the telegram, all sorts of new technologies around communication was coming into being. Not only did they have newspapers, but they had the latest news from different parts of Europe and wider, being fed into that environment. It was a bit like an early internet. Library, classes, lectures, concerts, entertainments, coffee, hey. Smoke rooms, well, that would have suited me. Chess and drafting, okay. Bit more visual there about that. And the institution really embodied the aspirations that we have, taking the new museum back there. A more attractive, a better facility, better adapted to requirements, wider scope for its operations, and its main purpose in the general diffusion of useful knowledge, another phrase that I really love. Okay. The aims of the institution reflect those developments, and its privileges are offered to all without distinction. The objects it seeks to accomplish being solely and wholly the moral culture, the mental improvement and the social happiness of its members. New audiences. And the values that we're taking with us of entertainment, enlightenment, learning, participation. All, of course, with the backdrop of temperance. This was an alternative to going to the taverns and having your entertainment with lots of beer. This was a more civilized approach, but equally as dynamic and entertaining. It was interdisciplinary, science with the museum collections, and arts through the music, theatre and exhibitions. Again, very much part of our thinking. An engagement with history, but also the new. The very latest in news, innovation, debate, contemporary thought, and the future. So you can see how we're very inspired by the history, and we think that we're embracing these values in the developments that we're now bringing into being over the next 12 months. Okay. That's my little introduction. It was supposed to be informal, and I'm now handing over to the more formal component of the talk. And saying to Jill Nicol, thank you so much, and I'll see you in a minute.
Hello everyone. So this is really going to be a whistle stop because I am going to speak really fast. Can you all hear me? I'm not mic'd up, but I do project. If I start going a bit quiet, someone just say at the back. So, 45 minutes, probably less than that, on the first 50 years of the 20th century. So just a little bit about me before we start, so you understand where I'm coming from. I trained as an artist, and in my mid-30s I went back to college and did an MA in feminism and visual arts, and that was a theory-based course, and then since then I haven't made any work since, so that's quite interesting for me. And then ever since then I've worked with arts, contemporary art and audiences in many different institutions in this country. And then last year I set up my own business called Lights Going On to make contemporary art accessible, because I got really upset, and continue to do so, by people coming into a white cube gallery space and looking at what's in there and going, what the hell is this? Why is this art? So my mission today is to contextualise some of that, what we call difficult work. Just a bit about language before we start. I think Adrian's introduction points out, the impact of modernism after the Industrial Revolution. Everything changed, everything speeded up. So most people in the art world break down modernism in terms of this the kind of 110 years, sort of after the Industrial Revolution up to about late 50s, early 1960s. But it's really all fluid and all up for grabs because there's no hard and fast cut-off point. And then postmodernism, literally after modernism, is from mid-1960s up to the late 1990s. So I can't really say where we are now. We are not really in an ism, and I'll talk about that in October in the next lecture. But the word contemporary I use to signify postmodernism, postmodernist practice. So when I say modern art, I'm sort of meaning modernism. And I'm going to show in this lecture and the next lecture, hopefully, why did postmodernism occur? What was that shift, that radical shift, that change in society, where artists were able to move forward and try out new things and feel really liberated in that? And that happens after the Industrial Revolution as well. So modernism is all about the new. It's all about excitement. It's all about looking for a utopian vision, for progress, for the future. And all the new developments that go along with that. The invention of the motor car, Freud and psychoanalysis. He publishes the interpretation of dreams right at the end of the century in 1899. Photography, the first film, the train that comes towards people in the cinema and everyone just screams and rushes out because there's this train coming towards them. That's in the 1880s. So where to start? What's the first image that one might think of for showing beginning of the last 100 years? So it could have been Cézanne, could have been Picasso, but I'm starting with Matisse and Women with a Hat, 1905. This isn't just any woman, this is Matisse's wife, Amélie, and she is a hat maker. And hats get bigger and bigger, apparently, between 1905 and reach a crescendo in 1911. But here we can see it's already quite big, this hat. And she is staring out underneath it with her green face. When Matisse put this into the salon, just got laughed at. Everyone's going, what are you doing? What the hell is this? It got hung, but it got hung above a doorway, so no one could really see it. So Matisse is part of a group called the Fauves, Fauvism, meaning wild beasts, because of this wild painting, this attention to colour. His peers, his other artist friends, said to him, when she came in, when she came in to sit for you that day, she must have been wearing some crazy colours, mad hat colours. He's going, no, she was wearing black. And now, whether that's true or not, I think what it signifies is that it didn't really matter what colours she was wearing. Matisse wasn't going to paint what was actually in front of him. He was going to paint something else. He was going to try and portray perhaps an emotional connection, or try and portray this portrait in another way that hadn't really been seen before. Cézanne was trying to do something else in his landscapes. This is a portrait from 1900, and Matisse would have seen this and borrowed from Cézanne. So there's this thing about when is something shocking? When is something new? Artists have done, it was ever thus. They're always trying to push the boundaries of what is possible, whether they get laughed at or not. And I've just popped this in because this is in the collection, and it's a wonderful rendering of a portrait, but it's back in 1842, and you can see it's a very realistic portrait. So, there's a massive shift to that. It's just massive. It's unbelievable in a sense. But this is even more shocking and unbelievable, if you like. This is perhaps one of the most iconic images of the 20th century, and it's Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Women of Avignon. And it's painted in 1907, and it's shocking for a number of reasons. It's shocking because the women are prostitutes, the women of Avignon, so it's a shocking subject matter. But also look at them. Look at them. They have been broken up. They have been fragmented, literally, as Picasso begins Cubism with this image. And he is very influenced also by primitivism. He's collected a number of artifacts and objects from other cultures. And the mask-like features of the two faces on the side, how do you draw a portrait when it becomes a mask like this? Is it about going back to basics? How are you depicting a face? How are you depicting a body? This figure sitting down here is apparently the pimp, is a male figure watching. Just to say, for many people, this is the image, that is the riff that marks culturally the 20th century. So this is a view of an installation in the Ethnography Museum in Paris in 1895. So all the artists in Paris and in Germany, in Dresden, would have gone to these museums which were starting to collect these objects, because with steamboats crossing the Pacific and the Atlantic, things were being brought back. So everyone had access to seeing these things. The other. So this is an X-ray of that figure's face, the man's face, and it's reworked again and again, and it's taken supposedly from an image, from a photograph. An artist called Gino Severini had a broken box camera. The lens was cracked, and he gave it to Picasso. And apparently Picasso used this to start working with paintings, and apparently this is where Cubism comes from. It's a contested idea, but it's something which is being researched at the moment. So this is an image of Picasso in his studio, and you can see some of the objects from Africa that he will have collected. So over in Germany, in 1905, starts German Expressionism. And so you can see it's really linked to the idea of trying to get back to a basic, primitive way to express the body, to express a portrait. So the German Expressionists used woodcut as this most, sort of, you hack literally at the wood. This is a cover from one of their manifestos. Lots of groups write about what they're doing and write manifestos. So writing and art are really linked at this point. So this is an artist called Carl Schmidt Rotloff. So you can really see here that he's totally taking his imagery from African masks. So just a couple of images on Cubism. This is, I always laugh, it's like 2 images on Cubism. It's crazy, but this is how it goes. We will do this whistle-stop tour. So Picasso and Braque start working with a fractured picture plane, but they also start working with collage. They basically invent collage. Collage meaning from the verb coller, to stick. So they start sticking wallpaper and bits of other materials onto their canvas and newspapers. So again, this is really, just sticking something on a canvas. But you've stopped painting. Again, this is something really new. So Die Brücke, that German expressionist group, Die Brücke, the bridge, that was a short-lived group. And then following it came another German group called Die Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider. And this group is incredibly interested in the idea of the spiritual, and the spiritual in music and in art, and how to convey spirituality and emotion with colour. And this is again a cover from their manifesto. This is one of their artists, Franz Marc, so you can see that he's really borrowing from Cubism as well, starting to fracture that picture plane, looking at basic shapes like triangles and cubes, and colour, vivid colour. So he's really pushing it now, 1914. So Franz Marc goes off to war, gets killed nearly straight away. So I am also missing out all the art that comes out of the First World War and the Second World War, because I have to, because I haven't got time, that's another lecture. But the First World War is a massive blip, an interruption into that idea of progress. Utopia no more. Everyone's dead. Lots of artists get killed, or they kill themselves later on in 1930s. This is Kaminsky, who was one of the main artists of the Die Blaue Reiter group. He's really influenced in listening to music and then trying to convey music through painting. So this is a later work by him, and you can see he's really gone into sort of very abstract shapes and very hard-edged as well. You probably recognise this. So then, in Italy, in 1909, so I'm jumping backwards and forwards, but in 1909, in Italy, starts Futurism, which is really embedded in the principles of the new, of progress. The artists, they get really excited about trying to show movement. This is a motorcycle. How can we show it moving? So literally, you paint it as a 360-degree revolution as the wheels go round. And I love this one, little dog, tiny legs, scampering along, trying to capture its movement. Sort of trying to capture the dynamic. And this is Natalia Goncharova, cyclist. So then in 1915, the Russian artist Malevich paints a white square on a white background to try and capture some essence of beauty, some essence of the sublime being where something is so beautiful you can't really describe it. But the underbelly of that is perhaps it's also so horrific you can't really describe it. Something you can't say with words. So it's really hard to show white on white. So there's the black version. You can see there how cracked it is now. But when we look at abstract art today, it's still something that many of us find it really hard to get our heads around. So my point here is, this is 1915. I mean, Malevich wasn't taken seriously at all. He was banished from Russia in 1929. And it's only in the 90s that his work started to sell for a great deal of money. But it's a sort of key moment. You know, if Matisse is saying, oh, she wore black, it's not the black of Malevich's square, but it's also about trying something new. Really, really trying to say something with hardly anything. Just colour, just pure colour. But I also think, I like to think that this is about the war. This is also about the horror, the terrible horror of the First World War. And how do you describe that with a painting? You know, perhaps this is the way you do it. So moving on to Dada. So Dada is it was a short movement that came out of the war. Dada literally means hobby horse, but it doesn't really make sense. I think it's more about da 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 da. You know, it's not really taking itself seriously. Dada was a very angry anti-art movement. Coming out of the war, people are like, well, forget all that progress. That was all just a load of rubbish. What are we doing now? We'll just start laughing. We don't really care anymore. So there's sorts of anger in this work as well. But Dada is really important because out of it comes another movement called Fluxus, and the ideas that are embedded in it, so you still see today in contemporary practice. The other key thing about Dada is they used photography. They started to cut up images that they saw in newspapers and photographs. So they're making collages, but with photos, so photo montage, photo collages. So this is a good example of that. So John Hartfield went on to make some really radical posters about Hitler using photo montage in the 30s. Because in their main feminism, I always try to put in women where I can. It's actually quite hard to find key women artists. Not that they're not there, but in this, you know, moment in history, they're usually not visible. But this is Hannah Hock, and she carried on making collages into the 1960s. The quality of this isn't so good, but it's an amazing, I think, link to kind of looking at ethnography, and visiting a museum, and then taking an image, a current image of a well-known actress in the 30s and superimposing them together. And this is Kurt Schwitters. Kurt Schwitters used to collect bits of detritus, bus tickets, rubbish from the streets and make little collages from them. But in his home, he started making a massive collage out of paper, a paper room, which he called Mertz. These are these big collages. This is his Mertz room. Needed a number of these. Amazing objects. Almost like you're making your own little burrow, really, aren't you? You're sort of burrowing into it. So, going back to 1914, 1917, and we need to just look at the idea of the ready-made. So this is Marcel Duchamp's famous urinal. 1917, you know, ages ago. Duchamp is probably responsible for the whole of contemporary practice, she said, sort of throwing everything up in the winds. But you know, Duchamp was acting as a postmodern artist at this point, literally taking something that was already made, ready-made, putting it in a gallery on a plinth, signing it with a false name, saying this is art. This is apparently the first ready-made in 1913, where it's a bicycle wheel placed on a stool. So literally, you're not making it unless you're assembling it yourself. You're taking it. You're taking this thing that already exists and using it for your own ends. And he remade it in 1951. This is really important to understand because, as I said, it's how a lot of artists think. It's about appropriation. It's about taking what's already there. So it's really important because what you choose is itself a creative act. You're taking away the useful function. You know, you can't ride any bike. You can't really go to the loo in that urinal. You've taken away its usefulness. And then you've given it a new meaning because you've put it in a gallery, you've called it something else. It's all about the idea of it. So this is Bottle Rack by Duchamp in 1914, and this is a contemporary artist called Bethan Hughes and her take on it in 2007. This is an artist called Sherry Levine, who's made her own fountain after Duchamp in bronze. Sherry Levine has made her whole career out of borrowing other people's work and just saying it's hers. This is a really good example of this, where Walker Evans, on the left, in the 1930s did a huge body of work capturing families in the Great Depression, rural families working on the land in America. And this is, Sherry Levine directly took pictures from a book that he made and then printed them as her own. So the Walker Evans estate had to buy them all. So maybe that's a question later on about appropriation. But it's something to cling on to for next month when we do postmodernism. So when we look, there's quite a lot written today about the role of the visitor, the spectator, the audience, and what it means to them to look at art. But Duchamp wrote this in 1959. So all in all, the creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work in contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualifications, and thus adds his or her contribution to the creative act. So basically it's saying that we complete the piece of work by being there. It also points out that when we come to the work, we decipher it in our own way and interpret it in our own way. If you come to something and you're in a bad mood, you'll feel slightly differently about it. If you came, you felt really happy or relaxed. However you are in that moment, you will read the work differently, and that is all okay. There is no fixed meaning to a piece of art. So, jumping to Constructivism. So Constructivism in Russia started in 1919 and was quite a long movement that went on into the 1940s and was again very much involved in trying to look at the new after the war, trying to clean everything up, trying to look at minimalism, abstraction, just to go back to basics. And this is Tatlin's model for a huge tower that would have been bigger than the Eiffel Tower. It never got made. But it's a really radical proposal. It was like a viewing platform with lights. So he was trying to use the newest technology that he could. So Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist and activist, remade that outside Tate Liverpool in 2007, a smaller version. And I think also this piece of work, which is now a permanent sculpture and observation platform just outside the Olympic Stadium, really relates back to Tatlin's Tower. How are we doing for time? So the Bauhaus in Germany starts also in 1919 after the war, and it's an interesting movement in that it is based around a space, a building, which brings together art, architecture, and design and craft. So it's like a mini school, if you like, but for artists to come together and start to have different kinds of conversations, trying to break down the barriers between those things, or not seeing that there are barriers in any way at all. So you can see the links to a kind of constructivist look. And this is the famous chair by Breuer, which gets remade again and again, which is a Bauhaus chair. So moving on to Surrealism, this is Dali, who I'm sure you all know. So Dali, obviously, really, the Surrealists are incredibly influenced by Freud and the interpretation of dreams, and about trying to reveal the unconscious mind. How do you tap into this bit? How do you make the invisible visible? So this is Magritte, and it's called the Treachery of Images, but it's the image of a pipe which says, "Ceci n'est pas un pipe." This is not a pipe. So again, this is not a pipe. It's an image of a pipe. Yeah? It's just playing with the idea of the words and the language, but this is also quite important for contemporary practice. And Man Ray, it's based in America and sets up a mini Dada movement with Duchamp in 1920, but it doesn't last very long. And then he comes to Paris and starts working with the Surrealists. He's incredibly interested in what the Surrealists are up to. Man Ray also plays around with photography, as you can see here. And this is Mera Openheim, a woman who has taken an existing object, a ready-made if you like, and then covered it in fur. So this breakfast in fur, which she made when she was 22, and I think struggled ever since to find, to keep going with this kind of making strange surrealist objects. So this is another key thing about surrealism. It's embedded in the idea of the unconscious and trying to reveal the unconscious through a number of ways, through automatic writing. But it also looks at how you might find meaning in a different way with changing objects, surrealist objects, so that they become disturbing or exotic or sexualized in some way. And this is Dali and Lost a Telephone. And this is Frida Carlo, working in Mexico. Frida Kahlo is aligned with the Surrealists, but very much over there in Latin America, working by herself. She's married to Diego Rivera, who makes enormous murals. So Frida Kahlo's, she was in a really bad accident when she was a teenager, and is disabled for much of her life, in a lot of pain. So this is, she paints constantly small, tiny images on tin which show this. And this is Louise Bourgeois. So Louise Bourgeois is based in America in the 30s and the 40s. She's married with 3 children. She's married to an art historian, and she is angry. She's really angry. She is also traumatized by her past, and she works for years and years making etchings and drawings and sculptures about this, about her life, about what it means to be a woman. So this is a series of drawings she makes over 2 years called Femme Maison, Women House. It shows a woman, literally, she has no brain, she has no face, she's trapped in the house, but she's got no pants on. So this is her, our deepest fear, that we might go out the house naked. So Louise Bourgeois is a fantastic example of someone who worked all her life without being recognised. She was only found, if you like, in her 70s, in the 80s, and she died 2 years ago at the age of 97. So over in Texas, in the Menhill Institute in Houston, they have a massive collection of objects that the Surrealists would have looked at, because the Surrealists were also incredibly interested in primitivism and objects from other cultures, and had a massive collection of these objects. So that this is a fantastic, it looked like a fantastic exhibition that we put on about 13 years ago, which looked at some of these wondrous objects. So moving on to abstract expressionism. So abstract expressionism is a reaction to surrealism, trying to get back to painting, trying to get back to, enough of all that dreamy stuff. It's about paint. So this is a famous image of Jackson Pollock making one of his artworks, and it's by a photographer called Hans Namuth. So photography plays its part here in terms of documenting a process, but they become a set of really important images in their own right. You can see all these online. So Jackson Pollock here is is literally called making the work. So we see the process. And the process is not this. It is not working at a canvas, doing this. It's this. It's this. He is moving, he is working, he is wandering. You know, so if you look at some of his paintings, you can see them at the tape, you can see marks of his boots. You can see bits of ash that fell out of his mouth when he was smoking. So this is also, the marks he is making also borrow from Surrealism. So there's this rejection of some of the ideas, the emotional connection with Surrealism. The thing about the marks, the drawing, come into play here. And it also heralds the beginning of performance art, which doesn't happen for a while, but this is a performance in itself. And I see that Tate Modern are having a show in November called From Painting to Performance, and it will take this, an image by Jackson Pollock, and look at how it's influenced performance, and then an image by Hockney, and look at how that's affected theatre. So to really look out for that one. So this is an example of the scale of it. So Helen Frankenthaler is also an abstract expressionist, more aligned to something called colour field painting, where the colours are more soft and luminous. Helen Frankenthaler found a way to paint which was to not coat the canvas with a protective covering, but to let the paint just drain in, almost like watercolour. And she really thinned her paint down so that it looks like a massive, thinned out washes of colour. So a couple of images of her making work, a little bit more on the edge there, but still, you don't usually see these so much, but they're also by a famous photographer called Ernest Nass. But there she is on the canvas. So you can see it's unstretched, it's just a roll of canvas and then directly painting onto it. So someone who will be in that Tate Modern show is Helen Almeida. Helen Almeida is a Portuguese artist who, like Louise Bourgeois, has been working for years, but only in the last, I would say, 5-6 years, has become visible in the art world. She's quite well known in Portugal, but it's only recently that she's sort of been discovered. So here she is in 1975, literally painting herself out of the picture, or you could say painting herself in, because she is there. She is the artist. She is painting. I am woman painting, and she's using a particular kind of blue, which is very close to an Yves Klein blue. Yves Klein, I haven't talked about him in this lecture, but he worked with a particular kind of blue always. So there's something about the feminine taken from the masculine. Another form of abstract expressionism is hard edge painting. So it's looking at colour, looking at form, but looking at the edges. Pattern, very involved with pattern. So this is Barnett Newman. Like Malevich, just taking one colour in a sense and really looking at what that colour does. What Barnett Newman does though is work with the line, different lines of colour as well. So when you do decide to take hardly anything and explore what that does, where those lines are on a canvas like this is really, really important, where they fit. And his work is usually really long, really big. So the idea is to get up really close so that all you see in your peripheral vision is red, so that you are engulfed by the painting. So this is a contemporary artist called Ian Davenport. He's an abstract painter who pours. He's famous for making work where he's put tins of paint on top of the canvas and then they've just poured down and puddled at the bottom. So this is a public art commission under the bridge near Tate Modern. Someone said to me in a recent talk, this looks like a Paul Smith shirt. And it's a really good thing to say, because it's true that art, fashion, architecture, design, craft They all blur together. That's just an example of, you can see what happens when that paint lands on the floor. So philosopher Jean-François Lyotard in the 70s says this: modern art presents the fact that the unrepresentable exists to make visible that there is something which can be conceived and which can neither be seen nor made visible. This is what is at stake in modern painting. So he's talking after the Second World War, all the horrors that took place there. What can modern painting do now? How can it describe this? Because that is unrepresentable. So again, this thing about how do you capture something you can't speak of? But perhaps painting, perhaps visual art is one of the few places which you can do that. You can do it. So, moving on to pop art. I'm nearly there. So quickly, pop art. Pop art is popular art. That's what it says on the tin. It takes from celebrity, it takes from consumerism. You know, this is Andy Warhol. He himself becomes a celebrity. So pop art is a backlash against abstract expressionism and all that washy painting stuff. Because this is about consumer goods. It's about money. It's about commodity. It's about selling your work. It's about making lots of screen prints. So lots of people can buy it, but you can also make money. Yeah, if you're Andy Warhol, you set up something called the Factory, which is a little bit like the Bauhaus, I suppose, but it's your place, your big studio, where you have muses and you make films in real time of your lover sleeping, you know, all sorts of things. I just put that in because Andy Warhol also went through a period where he really got interested in death and destruction. So this is an image of the electric chair. So over in England, Richard Hamilton was also exploring the same kinds of ideas around popular art, popular culture. And this was a poster for his show at the Whitechapel in 1956. Just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing? So, look, you can buy a Hoover. At last, you can make, you know, housewives, you can make your life easier because we now have Hoovers. We now have music players. But you could be a pin-up, you could be a bodybuilder. Anything's possible in this brave new world. Pop art straddles, I think, the place between modernism and post-modernism. But I'm going to end with Fluxus to take us into the lecture next month. So as I said before, Fluxus is a kind of, you know, its legacy is from Dada. And its purpose to promote a revolutionary flood and tide in art, promote living art, anti-art. So it's linked very much to the artist, the musician John Cage, and his piece of work, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which is a piece of anti-music, if you like, where you're sitting in the audience and there's all the instruments on the stage and all the musicians come on and they sit there and they don't play their instruments for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, but it is recorded as a piece of work because the sounds that everyone else is making is the work. So it's the non-music. So this is an artist called Angkawara. He's a Fluxus artist, but Angkawara, for years and years now, since the late 60s, has made his art where it's about him and his life and his everyday life, and it's about him marking time. So in the 70s, he went through a whole period where he sent postcards to his friends, telling them when he got up. I got up at 11:10 a.m. I got up at 8:45 a.m. Now I tell you, if you've got, you know, if you're Annick Herbert, you're very lucky because these are worth a fortune now. So Fluxus is also the movement which starts mail art, M-A-I-L, you know, where people send things through the post to each other. So little small gestures Another huge series of work that Angkawara has done is date paintings. So this is where he gets up in the morning, draws out the date, today's date, and then he paints it. And if it's not finished by midnight that night, it gets destroyed. So this is some examples of some of those date paintings. And this is ongoing, he's still doing them now since the late 60s. And if he's based in different places, then he will do it in the language of the country and where he is based. And Namjoon Pak is a Fluxus artist who worked with TV and video, really pushed the boundaries of new technology. You know, when the TV first appeared, Namjoon Pak started working with what TVs could do within an artwork. So this is him collaborating with Charlotte Moorman. So when she plays these TVs, you see music and orchestras playing out the screen. So Joseph Boyce is aligned to the Fluxus movement. Joseph Boyce, German artist. But Joseph Boyce is much more than just a Fluxus artist. You know, in this short lecture, I've gone through some of the isms of a 60-year period. And many artists do not fit into those isms. It's just a sort of easy way to give this kind of lecture, and because it's there to compartmentalise for us how artists have worked. But Joseph Boyce straddles many things. He was a shaman, he was a teacher, he was a writer, he was an activist. This piece of work, I like America and America likes me. Joseph Boyce hated America. It's German. He was invited by a New York gallery to make a piece of work there. So the story is that he got off the plane and wrapped himself in felt being one of the materials that he used all the time. So his feet didn't literally touch American soil because it was wrapped in this material. He got into an ambulance, and the ambulance took him to the gallery. He went straight into the gallery and spent 3 days with a coyote. So the coyote for Boyce is a symbol of Native American Indians, and the coyote is revered by Native American Indians. But of course, it's seen, gets shot by everyone else. You can see this on YouTube. To type it in, you can actually see him there fighting with this coyote. But only after 3 days, they get on quite well and begin to, exist together in harmony. So in 1982, Joseph Boyce was invited to create a work for Documenta. Documenta takes place every 5 years in Kassel in Germany. Just finished this year, so we have to wait another 5 years. But he planted 7,000 oak trees. And with these oak trees you also have to plant the oak tree with a piece of basalt stone. And the idea is that when you plant your oak tree, it's a sapling. And there's your basalt stone, which is one of the oldest stones in the world. And over time, the energy literally shifts between them because the tree will grow, but that stone will stay there. And this is an ongoing project around the world. So oak trees are planted in New York. There's one outside the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds. So this is to wrap up. We did this very quick look at these things. Thank you for bearing with me in this journey. What comes next is another whole load of stuff in Postmodernism in October. So I hope that you'll all be here again. I just want to, before I hand over to Adrian, I'll just leave you with this quote by the wonderful John Berger, who wrote Ways of Seeing, 1972. The relationship between what we see and what we know is never settled. And if we think back to that Tracey Emin, I know, I think this thing about knowledge, what we think we know, what we think we're looking at, is a really kind of good metaphor for the new museum. Okay, thank you.
the right button. That's good. Thank you so much, Jill, for doing that, taking us through that journey. The second half of the journey follows in October, where we move from the 1960s or thereabouts to the present day and look at what's been happening, which is equally as prolific and enormous change has taken place, very accelerated pace of change. Why are we doing this? Well, we'll come back to the museum, because key to the museum is the relationship that we have with contemporary artists. And as you can see from just that 40 minutes, the amount of ideas generated within those artists' movements and work and lives is phenomenal. And in October, you'll hear a similar story, bringing us up to date. Museums have almost sort of developed in parallel to modern contemporary art, and what we want to look at really in a little bit now, but also in October, is how museums and art galleries have had to actually adapt and change to cope with all this artist practice, which is increasingly getting slightly out of control. It's beginning to challenge the institutions of galleries and museums. So how are galleries and museums actually going to deal with artists? How are they going to collect artists in the future? And then there's the relationship between how museums have impacted on artists. That's a well-known story. So we look at Picasso and the influence of ethnographic museums on his work. But there's another story that we've got to try and tell, which is how artists have begun to affect how museums think of themselves and how they work. I'll just pick up with Joseph Boyce, just very briefly. Jill said how important he was in terms of creating space for what's happened in the last 50 years. He's very famous for saying that being a teacher was his greatest work of art. He's quite famous for a lot of slogans, actually. He was an activist, German Green Party founder member. He founded a political party for animals. He came up with this phrase that everyone is an artist. And he'd actually borrowed that from an Indian philosopher who put it slightly more gently and said that the artist is not a special kind of person, but every person is a special kind of artist. So Boyce starts to take us into this territory where we're looking at, he's almost saying, I don't want artists to take ownership of this thing called creativity, because that's a bit of a myth. The artist is a creative person, fine, but actually, so's an engineer, so's a nurse, so's a dustman. It's about an attitude, it's about an approach to life. It's what he would call an anthropological approach to creativity. So all these ideas are flying around the art world and they're impacting on galleries and museums increasingly. We're setting the scene with these two lectures, looking at artists' ideas, artistry, because we want to work with artists as part of the new museum. They are integral and embedded. But what we're doing is we're making the connection between the museum collections and art practice. We are not opening a museum where we have a big white cube space. We're opening a museum where artists are going to be engaging with the museum collections. And the mission statement, this is a 50-word mission statement. It's how the dynamic of working with artists can enable reinterpretations of the past and reveal the multiple narratives, the many stories of the artifacts held within the museums and archives collections. There's no standalone contemporary art program. The whole focus is how can we engage the two things. And that's a very postmodern practice. A little bit more about, I'm not going to dwell on this because we're already running late, as you know. We want to work with established international artists. We want to work with Shropshire-based artists. We want to work at all levels and in all places. And it's some of our international artists who are featured in this programme. But we'll also be giving a platform to what we're doing with artists that are based within the county as well. And I'll talk more about that next time. There's a little history here of what's been happening in Shrewsbury. I came here 10 years ago having worked at the Tate in Liverpool, which is where Jill and I first worked together. And this was one of the first things that I did, which was to bring Anthony Gormley and Field for the British Isles. We put it in St Mary's Church. Some of you might have seen it. Anthony Gormley, very influenced by Joseph Boyce, by the way, as many, many artists have been, in terms of an approach. This is a piece of work that consists of 40,000 terracotta figures made by 100 people who were not artists. It was just 100 people, family people, grandparents and kids, that actually were drawn from a community that surrounded the brickworks which is necessary to make this piece of work. It's an amazing, it was an amazing installation, and it does actually sort of link into those ideas about creativity and what is art and what is an artist, and also links into the idea that Jill was making about the meaning of a work of art changes. It changes due to its location, it changes due to the viewer, it changes due to what's happening at that time. This installation opened about 2 weeks after 9/11. And so I've got a visitor book in the museum still, which is incredible. We had 30,000 visitors in 5 weeks, and it's a complete outpouring about 9/11, because that piece was being experienced at that particular moment in time. We've been working with artists within Rowley's house, as many people know. This is just another quick example of how we've been working and how we want to continue to work. This is about art in a heritage context or within a museum context. This is the work of an American artist called Brandon Ballinger, influenced by Joseph Boyce. Oh, hey. Activist, ecological activist. What Brandon did was he sent me some artwork. It was artwork, you can see it on the walls in the background. They're actually the photographs that he took of the specimens that Charles Darwin gave to the Natural History Museum of his pigeon collection. And Brandon's very, very keen to reclaim the pigeon as a wonderful creature and not the vermin that we often refer to it as. But what he also did, what I invited him to do, was to select objects from our taxidermy collections. So he chose all the birds that we have in our collections that are endangered or extinct or under threat. And he positioned them within the room as well. And we did all this remotely, because Brandon couldn't get to the UK actually. We did it via Skype and internet and emails. And it was another way of working, a remote sort of relationship that we had. And that was the star of the show. That's an object from our collections. It's a brown kiwi, extinct, and yeah, I think it's a really good example of how we try and work with artists. We're trying to give a new context to the historic objects that we have, while promoting and supporting the ideas that contemporary artists are trying to explore, which are often radical, sometimes difficult, sometimes challenging. But I think that's what we need. This, I'll just wave it at you because then we must stop. I'm sure 11:32, yeah. This is a quote from a book called Art and Artifact, the Museum as Medium. And it's the only really seriously decent survey history of this relationship between the artist influencing museums. Not the other way around. This is a survey of artists who've worked with museum institutions, looking at the collections and looking at how their practice gives us a new take on collections. This is going to be so quick now. This is an American artist called Fred Wilson. Who? Black American artist. This is an installation at the entrance to a museum in New York. He took the uniforms from 4 other museums in New York of the guards. So that's what you're looking at. You're looking at 4 different versions of museum guard uniforms. The mannequins are black. They're headless. Fred Wilson is very famous for doing a project, ongoing project called Mining the Museum. And he starts to question the museum itself as an institution, who it employs, what it collects, what it says about history. It shakes the museum, actually. and he was invited in, and is being invited in continually to museums to bring that kind of political, challenging approach. A much more gentle challenge to the museum is this is an artist who, when was given a residency at a museum in Germany, discovered that there was a big scheme going on with German dentists. They were giving out free toothbrushes, dental hygiene scheme. So the idea was that people would exchange. So the local dentist practices have now got, by default, this massive collection of used toothbrushes. What does the artist do? Says, right, I want to put that in the museum. That's going to be my display in the museum. This is about what we value as a museum. What do we collect? Why do we collect it? Is a used toothbrush a significant object? Well, I think actually in this sort of context, with this sort of background, it becomes equally as important as some very, very valuable historic artifact. It just speaks about collecting and about us in a slightly different way. And this is another example of that sort of thing. The collection yellow, installed as a beautiful museum display, and what is it? It's all the domestic bottles that we use in our daily life. And again, it's kind of subverting what the museum's about, or questioning what we're doing in museums. Why do we collect? What do we value? And then this one I love. This artist was invited to do a piece of work during the redevelopment of a museum. So you've got the building in the background. This is a bit of the edge of the scaffolding. And what he's done is he's taken a replica of one of the museum artifacts, and he's just got it sort of poking out into the world outside. And it brings us on to another issue that we'll talk about in October, which is the concept of the museum without walls. Museums are increasingly looking to extend their practice and their engagement with the community through not confining themselves actually by the institutions that they're operating in. But that's another story for another day. Right, I think we've just about got there. We're 5 minutes over. This is what we're working towards. This is the background to why we want art and collections and history to be such a dynamic part of what we're doing. And yes, I do believe that with the new museum, with this venue, and thanks to everybody here today, if you can hear me, we've got Keith in the projection room, we've got a bunch of technicians who did a lot of running around to sort out a problem. We've got the girls out there who opened the coffee shop early. So big thanks to everybody here, and of course a big thanks to everybody here. This is about building a community here as we move forward to the opening of the new museum. So I hope that you've found it interesting, useful, enjoyable, and that you begin to see yourselves as a new network, a new community of people.